newspapers reported accounts all across Europe, Switzerland.
Yeah, they
Germany,
noticed increases.
Western Germany, unfortunately, in one newspaper they were using becquerel units. One disintegration per second rather than Curie's 3 times 10 to the 10th disintegration per second, and there's some misunderstanding that OSHA that, oh, these are Curie's.
That'd be scary.
So they're up by 10 orders of magnitude, and the public really
difference.
were panicking. Really distressed.
Yeah, interestingly, as I interviewed some of the scientists there, I just asked them some also personal questions like, where were you at the time? How do you feel like this has affected your life? One of them had a really interesting comment. He felt that the Chernobyl accident essentially led to the downfall of the Soviet Union, that it was one of the main things, sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. Both in terms of, it forced the Soviet Union to be much more open after this occurred. They couldn't afford the secrecy anymore. And also, in terms of monetary, obviously they didn't have a whole lot of money before this time anyway. At this point, the Soviet government had to move thousands of people from their homes, build them new homes to live in a different location, pay to have this whole thing, the sarcophagus built. All of those financial burdens on the country, this particular scientist I interviewed, he felt that that was a major factor leading towards all of the Soviet Union. Now, in terms of determining how much dose people received, a lot of the dose was mainly internal dose. You can imagine, unless you were really close to the reactor at the time that it happened, the main way you're getting radiation is the radionuclides that are coming down, and the main way it's really going to affect you more than background radiation is if you're ingesting it and it's giving you the dose from within. So one of the first ways that they use, scientists, to try to determine what kind of dose people were receiving is, this is a rough drawing that they actually gave me. They'd have just a scintillating detector, a nice tube one, and they just have the patients kind of curl around, sort of create the geometry so that they were enclosing it for the most part, and they try to get a reading and subtract the background from it. That was their first knee-jerk way that they dealt with it. Then they developed these buses that they take around to some regional towns. A lot of the people who were in the areas that got the worst amount of radio contamination lived out in the countryside. I mean, these were people who grew their own food to eat. They didn't live in the city at all. And so to encourage them to come into the testing facility just wasn't a reality. And so currently they have testing facilities set up in a lot of these little small towns. And before they had all those set up, they set up this bus where they take the bus around. Up here in the front you'd have the gamma spectrometer and a lot of the computing information. Here you'd have the detectors 1 and 2, which you can see up here. They'd have the patient sit down. They had lead around him for a lead shielding. And then they had the detector there to try to get in the and then back here they just had basically a table, kitchen area. They went around, they try to get an idea of what sort of internal radiation doses people had. This is a picture of, at their facility actually, these are the first design that they used. The backing of this chair is all lead. And then they'd have the patient sit there and they'd have to adjust it so that the detector came right up to their chest, and they'd be measuring for increased levels of reactivity. Generally that would be coming from cesium-137. You wouldn't really be able to detect the strontium-90 because it's a pure beta emitter, so the beta particles aren't going to be able to come out of the body. But occasionally some of the gamma rays from uranium or plutonium that might be in their lungs, you'd be able to pick that up. Eventually they needed a better detector that would work for the whole body, especially for trying to pick up on strontium. This is another design that they currently use still for people who are living out in the countryside, just to monitor their levels of cesium. And so they have a chair that they just sit in while the measurement's taking place, and if you can actually pull this front part of the chair down and see what they have behind it. They have a detector right within the chair, and there's just, the lining of the chair is like a hole cut out, so to speak. All there is the leather on that hole, and then the padding's everywhere else. It's got a lead backing on the chair, so in theory, only patient's reactivity and some background that penetrates the patient goes into the detector. This is their whole body counter that they developed. They took steel from decommissioned Soviet ships and built this tiny room that they'd stay in. They had a bed that the patient would lay on, and they'd have 6 detectors in a line underneath the patient. so they could get an idea of the distribution of the radioactivity throughout their body, just a rough estimate. They had this detector that could move back and forth across the patient to get a more fine resolution on the distribution of the radiation in the patient. Number 3, they had some phosphate detectors that they'd place over the lungs of the patient in order to get a better idea of what sort of contamination they had in their lungs, specifically looking for like uranium, plutonium. One of the gammas from uranium is really close to the same energy as the K1 X-ray of lead, and so they needed the phosphate detectors where you have the fast-acting crystal and the slow-acting crystal to differentiate the two. And they also set up a beta detector for number 4, and they put it on the forehead. That's because the strontium, since it acts like calcium, it would go to the bones. And since it's a pure beta emitter, there's no gamma you can use to try to get an idea of how much strontium there was in the bones. So their idea was to find a place where the bone's fairly homogeneous, where it's just bone and then skin, where it's large enough that they can get a reading of some betas coming through, and then they can make calculations and adjustments to estimate the distribution and the amount of strontium throughout the body.
That's the forehead?
Yeah. Yeah, they put it on the forehead. And so here's, unfortunately, I had to touch up that picture, I apologize. But, yeah, I have a film of, there's a, okay, it's very faint in here, but there's a man laying here, the detector, yeah, there we go. The man laying here, and there's the phosphate detectors being put over his lungs. See some of the writing on the old decommissioned steel from the Soviet ships. And they still go in there. Mainly now, the people who are getting measured in the whole body counter are people who are working on the new safe confinement for the sarcophagus. Typically speaking, the radionuclides that you're going to be detecting inside people, you want to keep up on. They're just normal citizens living in areas that are slightly contaminated. You're going to be looking at levels of cesium-137 for the most part, and that's about it now. But for people working on the reactor, obviously they're around areas where they can get a whole lot more nuclides specifically into their lungs, and so they just use this whole body count.
Is their main worry uranium, plutonium?
Yeah, in terms of the lungs.
What fraction of the deaths or cancers would have been stirred by insulin put on mass?
At this point, in terms of the documented deaths that they can directly attribute to the radiation, there's not very many of them actually that necessarily would have been because of that. A lot of the deaths that would occur from inhaling radioactive particles into the lungs will probably be showing up over the next several years as those people end up developing lung cancer and then eventually dying of it. People who they've documented that have died from it, they said there are 7 children who died of thyroid cancer, and I believe I've only read, the highest number I've seen is 47 people who had died as a result of acute radiation syndrome, people who were either working in the plant or the liquidators who were going in and putting out the fire and building the sarcophagus. Other than that, there are some other deaths that I think of by leukemia now that they're starting to document as well from the cleanup workers, specifically those people who were there at the reactor building the thing over this melted down core of the reactor. And so you would assume that those people would have the worst case scenario in terms of the radiation dose.
So the total deaths we're talking about is less than one plane crash or one good bomb in Baghdad?
In terms of the deaths that are directly attributable to the radiation, there's a big issue that they have, and the scientists at the Research Center for Radiation Medicine run into it all the time. They've actually found, and they have a whole book of documented health effects that they've noticed that are larger than what should be normal for that particular region of the world and population and everything. An increased amount of lots of different health issues. Unfortunately, it seems like at this point that many of them are stress-induced, similar to post-traumatic stress syndrome from these people getting evacuated from their homes, thinking, I was living a mile away from Chernobyl when it exploded, and it was almost like a reverse placebo effect of sorts. And so a lot of the health effects, they're having a hard time statistically showing that it's the radiation itself that caused this health effect, and it's not a result of some sort of psychological